welcome. We're very glad to have a lot of people joining us on this Zoom webinar, but also to have people able to watch this on Horizon House TV. The program this evening is sponsored by two of Horizon House committees, by the Diversity Awareness Committee, and I acknowledge and thank Sally Wren for being here with us, and by the Environment Committee, of which Bill Roach is chair, and Bill Roach is here with us. We are particularly happy to have you with us tonight, Sharon Chen, speaking to us about Front and Centered, an organization with an enormous reach, and we very much appreciate you being here to tell us about it. You have a considerable background in various aspects of social service and working with groups of all sorts, and that probably will all come out in the process of your talking with us. I think we should just start right in and invite you to tell us about Front and Centered. Tell us about the kinds of places that your constituent groups are working in, and we will probably be anxious to ask questions, but we'll try to hold the questions until after you've had your full chance to speak.
Thanks so much for your kind words, Jean. I'm excited to be here. Thank both committees for inviting me. We'll have, hopefully that this will be a conversation. I do have some slides that I'll share with everyone, and then we can have some question and answer period. Jean has promised to help me manage questions. I think the way we've decided to have questions is for people to hit the raise hand button that should be at the bottom of your screen. If everyone sees that, that's the best way to go. But feel free, if you can't figure that out, to raise your physical hand. Peter, it looks like you figured out how to make that work. So, and with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can see the slides that I've got. So hold on just a sec. There we go. Can everyone see this front page? It says Front and Centered. Perfect. So again, my name is Sharon Chen. I'm the Civic Capacity and Resource Manager at Front and Centered. I've been working here since 2019. A little bit about myself. My professional background is actually in computer science. So I grew up on the East Coast and came to Seattle because I was recruited by Microsoft, and I worked there for 12 years in their research and development teams. After I stopped working at Microsoft, I had the, I guess, benefit of having time for my projects, and I was a very passionate environmentalist, first working on chemical policy reform issues. What that means is looking at the judicious use of chemicals and trying to reduce the level of toxic chemicals in our everyday lives. So if you heard of BPA in baby bottles and flame retardants in your furniture and mattresses that are applied by the pound, that kind of thing, those were the environmental issues that I thought most about, I would say about 15 years ago. Of course, climate change is the existential crisis of our lives, of our planet these days. So as I learned more and more and paid attention to environmental issues, that became quite a focus. And these days, given a broad understanding of many of the challenges that we all face to our environment, I'm very interested in civic engagement and democracy issues, because certainly putting in place the solutions to address these things is going to require some changes in how we as communities make decisions. So that's a little bit about myself. I wanted to start with talking about what vision Front and Centered has. And I'll get to sort of the more mechanical topic of what it does and how it functions in a little bit. But first, I wanted to share that we envision a future where our communities and Earth are healed and thriving. Our people have dignified work and the building blocks of opportunity and prosperity. And the government values, respects, and represents us broadly, all communities. Jean asked me earlier to cover some examples of environmental threats to particularly disadvantaged communities. So I'm going to go into that area to give some context behind the work of Front and Centered. Just as a review of these of the threats I'll be talking about, the climate crisis is a racial justice issue, an economic justice issue, and a consequence of an economy based on extraction and exploitation. Oops, sorry. Apparently I can, sorry, I was getting my direction confused. We can talk about what I mean by all of these as I go through the following slides. So first, I'm going to talk about threats to disadvantaged communities and just give examples. I'm sure that many of us can come up with the examples too. So I'll share mine and maybe ask you for some that some of you think of. One environmental threat is floods. And an example of how this hits the Black community is Hurricane Katrina, for instance. A lot of the experience of that community in Louisiana in terms of the resilience that their communities were set up with before the hurricane, or lack thereof, I should say, informs a lot of the policy making that today's Black Lives Matter policymakers think about. The communities associated with Katrina, well, you know what happened at that time. The lack of transportation options out of the area when this crisis was hit, the way the communities were not set up in a resilient way, etc. So this is an example of some of the experiences of this community. Another example is communities of color and Indigenous people are more impacted by heat waves. And this is tied to the environmental health of Black mothers, for example. So certainly heat waves hurt us all, but there are communities that suffer more profoundly when there are such things. And something as that might not immediately come to mind, like underweight babies or premature births, is something that can be tied directly to these environmental health experiences or challenges. Another just example, pollution affects certain communities different than other communities. Asian Americans apparently have extremely high exposures to the to air pollution. So this is another example. But one thing that I wanted to talk about is thinking about racial justice and diversity issues is not just because there are threats to overburdened communities. Certainly overburdened communities are overburdened, right? They are hit first and worst. But climate change threatens everyone because it turns out that, air flows away from communities where pollution happens, water flows, and these issues eventually affect everyone. And so one thing that we as a greater society should think about is many of these communities wind up serving as canaries in the coal mine, right? And if we want to really protect each other and ourselves, we have to think about what happens to indicator communities. So understanding this is why at Front and Centered, we believe that the voices and wisdom of those who are hit first and worst by our environmental challenges need to be a key part of the decision-making about the solutions. And I'll talk even more about this later. So what is Front and Centered exactly? So we are a coalition of over 65 community groups across Washington state that are led by people of color. Now, these organizations have come together. We have come together in the context of a coalition called Front and Centered to fight environmental health issues. Our coalition is made up of organizations that do not necessarily have environmental missions in their individual missions. So, for example, our coalition's members, some of them are Black churches, some are farm worker collectives in Skagit County. We have immigrant rights organizations, and some of our organizations are super small that don't have any staff, are completely volunteer based, small, tiny organizations working in a particular location. Others are statewide organizations with, multi-million-dollar budgets. For instance, One America that works across the state on immigration, not immigration, but immigrant rights issues. So there's a very wide diversity of organizations within our coalition. But the key thing that ties all of these organizations together and motivates all of our member organizations to work together is an acknowledgement that the environmental health impacts to our communities matters to the communities, and also that the voices of our communities have been traditionally missing from the conversations around solutions. For instance, in the legislature. So this list here, I'm not going to read, but isn't just a smorgasbord, so to speak, of the types of activities that we do that I wanted to share. But more the fundamental ethos behind what we're trying to accomplish is illustrated by this slide. What we're after is this circle to the lower right here. I talked a little bit about this in that very first slide about our values. And what we have is over on the left is how we go about it. We do advocacy, we have community solutions and alignment. This includes listening sessions for many of the communities across the state. There's research and development, and then member and supporter community of our communities to engage. And what that means is many of our communities, sometimes they are in survival mode. For instance, in the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic, people have been so busy trying to make ends meet that maybe they don't have the capacity to engage in policy discussions in the community levels, in community meetings. And we addressed those sort of systemic problems to try to make it so that people do have the capacity to engage on those issues. What we see on across the top in the columns there is are the I would call it topic areas that integrate with the work that we do, all mesh together to support the healthy, thriving communities that is our vision. So for instance, we talk about mobility justice, which is another way of talking about transportation, energy justice, local pollution, and then governance issues. What does it all mean? So there's a lot of words there, and it can sort of feel like a word salad, and I understand that. So I'm going to talk about what am I talking about? So there's a common theme behind environmental problems, right? So as a person who has thought about not just transportation or climate change, but as someone who has thought about environmental challenges, like so many of them, after thinking about so many of them, I realized there's a common theme behind why they happen, right? And it's because of an economic culture that we have in the US that is based on an expectation around extraction and exploitation. And this goes towards, why is it okay to hurt the earth in the way that we do, to take from the land in the way that we do. And it's not just limited to the land. It's also how is it set up that we feel like exploiting workers? And I'm not saying all companies or et cetera, but there is a expectation in our culture where profit equals the cost of capital, profit equals revenue minus the cost of the capital minus the cost of the labor, right? So that's an equation, so to speak, describing our economic activity. And our culture is based on maximizing that P, the profit. And so the way to maximize that P is to maximize revenue, of course, but always to minimize the cost of labor and the cost of that capital. And we imagine that we can imagine a different kind of world where the P is not necessarily the thing that has to be maximized, right? Could we maximize, for instance, the well-being of people and rearrange using algebra that equation that still is, a kind of natural law, but put some emphasis on some of the other factors in that equation. The other thing that we look at this world, I guess, this situation in, is that the roots of our problem, why environmental problems and challenges exist, is the root of it is based in power imbalances. And what I mean by that is there's seems to be too much power located in the hands of too few. And those too few get to make a lot more decisions on the behalf of the rest of us. And it feels as though all of us who are looking at the potential of climate change, for instance, coming down, the majority of us want to see some strong action on this, but somehow power is all located in the hands of a very small number of people, and the greater society doesn't have that. So front and centered, we're a coalition, right? But there are many communities, if there was more balance of power, would have more say in how things can get fixed. So I sometimes conceptualize this power imbalance as a set of pipes. And where we think about where are there communities that have some wisdom, but maybe aren't being heard. And so therefore it's almost like their power is leaking from them, or is not, or is getting stuck someplace where it's all getting centralized and hoarded elsewhere. So whose voices do we need? Why might we not hear them? Which voices are missing? And in particular, one of my roles at Front and Centered is to also think about how is our movement resourced. There are ways in which philanthropy perpetuates these imbalances of power. And I'll give you some specific examples. So this is kind of like my conceptual view of how power flows. You know, you have the state legislature, academics, communities, policy experts, businesses. And if things were all flowing in balance in our society, all of these different types of decision makers would have an appropriate level of power, but currently we don't necessarily. And so where do some communities need to have more power? That's something that our organization thinks about a lot. So this one example of stuck plumbing that I wanted to give. So we all eat every day, right? Sometimes three, like, you know, for some of us 3 times a day, for many of us even more than that. And one thing that we've observed is farm workers, those are the people who touch and feel our food on a daily basis. And yet their voices are systemically undermined, because paying them would mean that it would be more expensive to deliver that food, or to grow that food, or to harvest it, right? So there are economic reasons why their voices, we would want to have them quieter. But it's not actually in our best interest as people who aren't farmers, who maybe depend on food, to have their voices systemically suppressed. Because who's going to let us know when there's a problem with our food, or that our food is starting to fail, that the fields are being affected by pesticides and our food is full of them, or our fields are starting to be affected by you know, a particular pest or heat, and that it's not growing as well as maybe it used to. It's just an example of where it's not smart long term for us to not benefit from hearing from them. So one background that I'll give in terms of the value system at Front and Centered is that our community's voices have wisdom, and for the benefit of all, these voices must influence how our government and society works. Fixing this is good for everyone. So we're a strong multiracial coalition dedicated to this idea. So before I get into the example of a specific thing we do, to tell you more about how the coalition is structured. So I mentioned that we're built from over 65 organizations of very different sizes and different missions across Washington state. We are governed by a community council that is made of representatives from our member organizations. And that council looks at what activity we might want to have, and activity could be associated with a campaign or a project that would collect wisdom from our communities. And the reason why this coalition was formed was because on their own, organizations, even though environmental health issues are so important and impactful, health issues are so important and impact these communities in such a strong way, they don't necessarily have the capacity on their own to, for instance, hire a policy expert or a lobbyist or a researcher. And so this is one way that we can band together and have the capacity to support experts in this area. So on staff, Bill was asking me earlier if I knew Paulo. Paulo is our transportation director. Paulo has a very long history of working on transportation issues in Washington state, and it's just wonderful to have him. But he is one person among many. We have Dr. Esther Min and working on data issues, and then Marielle Therasingham working on energy. So it's possible to have this brain trust where before we had the coalition, individual organizations wouldn't have the capacity to support higher staffing those roles. So I wanted to share one example of giving voice to communities that I'm talking about, because I know a lot of times this can feel very esoteric and woo-woo. So one thing that we've done recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in conjunction with University of Washington's School of Public Health, Front and Centered built something called the Environmental Health Disparities Map. And I'll show you the next slide real briefly to give a visual of what this is. So what this environmental health disparities map is, it's a map, of course, of all of Washington state down to the precinct level. So you can, it's interactive and you can click, on individual precincts. And at each precinct gets a score, and you can see that it's color coded. And what these scores are composite score given environmental burdens in that geographic location. So you've got, for instance, burdens such as air pollution levels, infant mortality, water pollution issues, et cetera, and interleave with socioeconomic factors, et cetera. And so what this composite score shows you geographically is where there are communities overburdened by environmental challenges. So this is all very interesting, right? But why is this important? So first, what happens when community members talk to their government. You can imagine someone who has asthma as a result of pollution going to some kind of community meeting or offering comments, right? Saying, hey, I am experiencing these environmental effects. Now that's just like a single story. And what the environmental health disparities map allows us to unearth for decision makers is the experience in aggregate. Now, I think we all knew, Peter was talking earlier about redlining, that something like redlining has a lot of like consequential effects, decades later, associated not just with property values and things that you would expect given, a real estate activity, but that reaches into environmental, harms, right? So what this map does is it really kind of puts in sharp relief this kind of information in aggregate, something that communities have kind of known for many years, but were not able to put in a form that decision makers can necessarily digest.
Sharon, can I ask you to
yeah.
put a link to that map in the chat?
Yes, I will grab that in a minute.
Okay.
First, let me tell you about how we use that. So for a year or two, this was just super interesting, and we hoped that decision makers would make decisions based on this map, right? But after, and this took a few years to pass this bill, but last year in 2021, Front and Centered, with the help of many partners, passed the HEAL Act. And what this act does, the nugget about what this act does is it requires 9 state agencies to decide how budget is spent based on the environmental health disparities map. So for example, if a Department of Health or the Department of Ecology is going to do some kind of project that mitigates environmental harm or build some project that is like a benefit environmentally, they are obligated not to make those investments in geographic locations that are disproportionately already burdened by environmental harm. In other words, do the common sense thing, which is if you're going to improve the environment, improve it where it is worst, right? And one would think that this was common sense and that we would have been doing this, from the get-go without such a tool, but that's just not how things happen, right? It's usually the communities that are very well off and able to advocate for themselves that get things like sidewalks or, bus service or whatnot. And so this is a pretty groundbreaking type of change, and is the ethos, I would say, of how Front and Centered likes to go about its work. So last year it passed, but that is just the beginning. Once a bill passes, implementation is a large part of the work, and we expect our organization to be engaged in that kind of activity for quite a few years. I'm not exactly, I don't know exactly how long it'll take. I don't suppose anybody does.
Forever.
Let me grab that link for you. Here we go. What's wonderful is that the health disparities map was so successful that the Department of Health has now taken it over as, all right, how do I get back to the chat? Here we go.
Don't let me interrupt you, please.
There you go. Yeah, you can click on it and play with it by yourself
You
now.
bet. Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay. So that was all I had prepared, but I figured there's all sorts of places we could take this conversation, and I'd let some of you guide what you're interested in hearing more about. I could talk about other similar tools to the map that we're thinking of. We have one in mind for transportation. I can talk about community data hubs and how that will encourage more civic engagement on the part of our member organizations. But I think I'll take a pause and see what people would like to hear more about or have questions about. And go ahead and use the raise hand feature.
Okay.
Tom Spiro, would you unmute yourself and you get your question next, and then we'll come back to others. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Sharon, for setting that background. Now, you mentioned that profit P is the major driver, and that may be the case, but it's not the whole of the economics here, because what gets left out of account, aside from people without profit, is that the public pays for a lot of the costs of doing business as usual, because there's no cost associated with what are called
environmental harms,
harms, right? So, but the government ends up paying for it. We all end up paying for it. If people in poor areas disproportionately flood emergency rooms, we'll end up paying for it. If flooding occurs, mostly the costs are covered by the government. So the government has a big interest in this. And of course, the government responds to whatever groups apply some leverage. Now, I want to mention that last night, there was a presentation at Town Hall. I don't know if anybody else saw it, but it was about farming and the environment by a guy named Don Stewart, who has worked for many years with something called the American Farmland Trust. Now, the American Farmland Trust was set up in the 80s with the explicit mission of bringing together farmers and environmentalists to find common solutions. They'd been at loggerheads, still are to some extent, but it worked because they came up with ideas like conservation easements and the spending of various budgets on conservation to help farmers out. And what really counted was getting both parties together in the same legislature. When a legislator had farmers on one side and environmentalists testifying in favor of a particular law, which was dreamed up by the American Farmland Trust, it passed without any difficulty, regardless of political party. So it occurs to me that something analogous to this could be set up here because, as you mentioned, the marginalized communities are the canary in the coal mine. You get the biggest public damage in those areas. And so if one could get communities together like you're doing and environmentalists together around the same problems, that could be a particularly effective way of getting legislature passed. Perhaps this has happened to some extent, but I think it's a much broader concept that could be applied.
Certainly creating common ground, or not creating, but highlighting common ground between constituencies is a concept that I mean, not just we, but like everyone, I think, has been working on, and is a very worthy set of activity, and certainly front and centered, agrees with you, and does that to a great degree. I think when I was making comments about the whole the culture of extraction that we have in the US, it's another way that I think we need to also be thinking about this problem, because yes, there's a lot of common ground and win-wins that we can make, but there are some fundamental sort of expectations about how economics and business is done that are worth examining. And you hit upon one that is like the biggest example, which is in that, equation that people think about. Okay, profit equals revenue minus the cost of capital minus the cost of labor. There's a bunch of terms that are completely missing, right? And I think we do our best to try to pass laws to get those terms to be reflected in the cost of doing business in this country. And that is, what is the cost of the air pollution? What is the cost of the water pollution, and the cost of the carbon that people are spewing out, et cetera. So I think we're all on this call going to try to do that, but it is worth asking ourselves why, like, we don't necessarily have to have, P be the biggest term, like the most important term in this equation. We could say that there are minimums that have to be met. I don't know if anyone here has heard about the concept of the donut in economics, where you cannot exceed the capacity of your planet because you only have one, and you cannot fall under the minimum of the well-being of the people involved in economic activity, those being like the consumers and the labor, the people providing the labor. You have to hit yourself in the donut, which is like this sweet spot in between. And it's worth us looking at the culture of that, because our economic laws, where we have that growth that we only have a good economy when our GDP is growing. It's a little weird, right? Like, it's like, when does that stop? Like, is that sustainable? So anyway,
So just follow up a little bit. I would, first of all, business is going to make a profit no matter what. Otherwise, it goes out of business. So I don't think it's
yes, of course,
worth spending a lot of time on the profit part. But business can also pay taxes if there's enough momentum to do that, as they definitely should in this case. It's also worth pointing out that when people do analyses of air pollution, the health costs are simply staggering. And almost all air pollution can be related to fossil fuel burning. Essentially, to stop fossil fuels, you would clear out the air. And the savings in health costs are just enormous. It probably pay for the whole thing.
Yeah.
If this could probably, this could be a basis for action between the health community, the environmental community, and the people on the ground. I think that would be very powerful.
Yeah. And that's one reason why we have, we started organizing around climate change, but we've changed to a much broader focus, which is environmental health, because health is a big deal about this that sometimes gets forgotten when we look at fossil fuels. And it's so interlinked and in such surprising ways. Someone was telling me recently that, for instance, in the Indigenous community, that if you look at a map of where Indigenous women and girls go missing, if you've heard of that, that it is clustered in the same places where fossil fuel fracking and oil drilling happens.
Yeah.
And it's scary how exactly, on top of each other, those two phenomenon are.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Bill, you're still muted. Go.
There, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Mine's a bit of a pedantic question, maybe, and it really goes in. I'm very interested in the HEAL Act and what you're hoping to accomplish with it, and interested also in how one measures accomplishment with it, and what will you tell the legislators in 2 years when they want to look at this again and see if this has been a worthwhile act to pass? What will be some wins from your perspective? How will you measure that?
Well, it can, what things that are currently measured, as exemplified by what you see in that map, are rates of environment health effects, right? So infant mortality, premature labors, asthma rates, especially in kids, learning disabilities, etc. And right now, those things are clustered in a very particular way that is a function of environmental challenges on a geographic basis. And what we would expect the HEAL Act to do is that it takes our agencies, our government agencies, whose goal, one of their missions, is to reduce, public health challenges that are based in environmental harms, and make it such that it's less of a strong predictor of where a community lives, will predict whether they get sick or not. And in particular, in so much in the ways that these geographic locations are connected to race, race and other features of identity that hopefully those features of a person's identity no longer predict so strongly their likelihood of dying of cancer or et cetera, that is connected to environmental pollution. That is the promise.
Sharon, you said that the state Department of Health would take over the map. Is there some investigation every year or every 2 years so that there will be answers to these questions that Bill asked?
Well, they, when I say take over, they host the app, the map now. So they, if you look at the URL, it's Department of Health site now. Now, from the beginning, the data that was aggregated in this tool was government. It was data from government, county health departments, from the state, and from, I believe, sometimes from municipal levels as well. The data that is fed into this map will continue to be updated. And I don't know what the mechanisms are for snapshotting and say, this is what it looks like in 2021, and now it's 2022. But that information is there and able to be manipulated, using computer. Does that answer your question?
It will continue to be updated as data appears, and
That's as data
Yes.
is collected. Yeah.
yes. And the amounts of money spent in particular places will take some time to have an effect on environmental health, because so many of these are long-term effects. But
That's right.
Yes. There's one
Sally,
more.
it looked like you had a question.
Yes. My question is, again, having started out on a farm, is how will this law affect the farm workers? Because so many of the chemicals are used there. and like you said, are in our food system. And I would think that those would be a hot spot where they're handling so many communities and children are exposed to them for more, infant mortality, all of the things that come with poisoning. And will this bill alleviate that in any near term that we could hope for?
This bill doesn't work directly like that. It doesn't pick out a particular set of problems or a set of people. What it does is the government agencies still have to do their work, which is figuring out where they're going to invest and make decisions and come up with the projects, etc. But what this particular act, and I don't want to say this is the be all and end all of all that
Right,
Front and Center
right.
does, but the thing that will shift as a result of this bill is putting an emphasis on, if you're going to do something that is going to help the environmental life of a particular location, then prioritize those communities that are already suffering the most.
Okay,
I
and
mean, to put it, I guess, in a nutshell.
my other concern is about the building like we're seeing in Seattle in the central area that's causing our people of lower income to have to move. And we're having a migration in Seattle to the south. We know we are.
Mhm.
And
Gentrification.
will this just help pedal this down a bit as the legislators have to consider more about preserving communities or the inequities involved, like in the redlining, as Peter mentioned?
If I heard your question correctly, I think you're asking about gentrification and
Yes, correct.
and people moving
Yes.
out of places. I don't think that I would say that this bill helps that directly either. But one point that I do want to make about the HEAL Act, I'm sure listening to what I've said about, okay, prioritizing those locations that are hit the worst, it is possible to take away from what I've said with the impression that the communities that are better off will somehow lose. And I want to talk about that directly, that it doesn't, it's not about that. And here's why. Pollution moves in ways that you don't expect, right? And because there's been an expectation historically that we sort of cluster environmental harms in specific places, there's been a feeling like, oh, well, it's like in that location, that's a throwaway community. It's like it's a place that nobody should want to live. And we as a society have somehow been okay with that. In the long term, that's going to hurt us all. So yes. I live in a fancy neighborhood at Capitol Hill. I'm sitting here. I live, a couple blocks from, Volunteer Park. Like, I live a nice, comfortable life. But one thing I realized, even given, that I live in this really nice neighborhood, the fact that there exists a place in my state where somehow it's okay to have a methanol plant or, whatnot, means that I'm ultimately in danger too.
Yes. Yes.
And that's kind of the concept that I'm hoping to convey with what we're talking about. It will be better for everyone if we don't allow anyone to suffer in that way long term.
I was just hoping of a slowing in the inequities. in the process. Probably too hopeful.
Peter, you had a question?
Yes, I do, or a comment. And I want to step out of the way for the good folks who've already talked. And so I lowered my hand and I'll say what I have to say and then I'll be quiet. I mentioned that I'm part of a group. It's a coalition of statewide organizations that work on issues of homelessness and housing, low-income housing. And if we could summarize the work that we do in 2 words, it would be housing justice. And I think housing justice is actually a parallel to your desires for climate justice and energy justice, because the more that we can create liberty for people to be able to live where they want to live, not be blocked by traditions, not be cast into poor neighborhoods where the pollution is the worst, not be denied housing because they happen to have a criminal record. We failed to get the Housing Justice Act through the legislature this last session, but it'll come. We'll keep coming back and we'll get that. Giving support to free legal aid to people facing evictions. That's something we accomplished last year. All of this leads to the ability of people to stay in their housing, to live where they want to live, not to be blocked because they happen to have a subsidy, a government subsidy that allows them to afford a rent. And so landlords might reject them because of that, because it's a marker of someone that is, quote, undesirable. All of this is very, very much working on a parallel track to the goals that you folks have. And I'm delighted that Jean has introduced us
Yes.
to the organization. And I will carry this back to my colleagues on the board of directors of the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance. And I think that a lot of profitable things will happen for the cause of our mutual justice desires.
Wonderful. We do love to make connections with partner organizations. Stronger together.
Yes.
And I see Sherry Williams.
Yes, I'm going to change the topic a little bit. I know that lead in both water and paint has been a big deal in both Seattle schools and just in general in the older homes. And it affects a lot of those older homes are what we would call, quote, the better neighborhoods. And a lot of them are in not as desirable neighborhoods to some people. And is that one of the topics that's trying to be worked on as you're looking at the environment?
I don't know if lead is one of the, it might be one of the inputs into the map, but I'm not sure. But it could be, and definitely there's a lot of plans for not only keeping the map updated with fresh data every year, of data that's already in there, but augment it with more and more different information. If lead exposure to lead is not already in there, it could very well be another piece of information that will be integrated into the map. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that right now.
I just know that a lot of schools that students and they cannot drink their water from water fountains. They have to bring in bottled water, and the kids have to do it. And that's not just in Seattle, King County, and a lot of other places.
No, that's true. I've got 2 high school students at Garfield High School, and they've been discouraged from drinking from the water fountains. So they bring a water bottle every day.
On that subject, if I could just interject, Tom Spiro here. The current dean of public health, who you probably know, Hillary Godwin, is actually an expert in lead pollution, lead chemistry. And lead, I think, is a great tool for community organizing because it's pretty easy to test for lead, and either in water supplies or in people. And if programs are organized at the ground level, do that, it's a big push to solve the lead problem.
Makes sense. Yeah. I just wrote that down as a note for myself.
Sherry, you haven't talked about what you do to help local groups who are interested in community organizing. Is that something that you encourage groups to do? You have expertise on or ways in which you have groups meet with other groups that are trying to organize themselves?
Sherry, you're muted in case you're trying to speak.
Jean just asked a question. Did you hear?
I think Jean, Sharon, not Sherry.
Yeah, Sharon, I was asking.
Oh,
Brunson.
sorry, Jean, you just went to muted too. But so you wanted to hear more about community organizing and how we participate in that activity?
Whether groups are learning from each other about their organizing techniques or their projects of what they're working on.
Yeah, that's so one aspect of what we do, and I had that list of, the types of activities we engage in. So one thing we do, we call it capacity building, right? So the capacity of our people to engage with the greater society and be heard. And so one thing that we have been doing is building relationships between organizations so that we have some of this exchange of knowledge of how to organize, et cetera. And so we have this membership, and the members are connected. We have a digital platform for them because they're across the state, and so they can exchange information. If you can imagine a sort of social media, it's called high-low, but we have social media for organizations where people can exchange information. We have a summit every year that, at least in the last couple of years, has been online, but we'll probably have for the in person finally this fall, where people from organizations come and meet each other and network and exchange ideas, et cetera. One thing we don't do is try to standardize how organizing is done. We definitely talk a lot about how particular organizations have done a listening session with their communities to share the possibilities and ideas, but we don't force it because, like I said earlier, the organizations are quite diverse, and they're serving very different populations. And so they each have their own cultural competency for their particular communities. And they can be very different in terms of what works for engaging with them. Whether it's because of the size of their communities or, some of them don't speak English as well. They all have different cultural competencies that need to be honored. Yeah. Bill, looks like you have a question.
Well, mine has to do with the agenda that you have, actions that you want to take, and where you need support and help. We as a community are very active in terms of our support for as individuals, as a part of the community. It would be very good to hear some things that you're working on that you need some support in?
Okay. Yeah. Well, besides member organizations, we also have a concept of partners. And that's something that I think Horizon House could consider being like an affiliate partner for Front and Centered. And that is relatively lightweight, and it's as simple as when we have a particular issue coming up, say, for example, in the legislature, staying in sync and talking about whether we would show up for each other's priorities, right?
Well,
So
that actually goes to my question. Do you have
Mhm.
something that, because we do show up in the legislature and make ourselves heard as individuals, we have to speak about it individually as opposed to as a group, but it's a very good way of reaching out, and we have the ability to do that. So is there something that, some specifics that you're thinking about for this
Yeah.
next session that you'd
Well,
like?
I think the hot topic is going to be transportation. So we've had this transportation package this past year, but there's going to be a lot more details about how the billions that are coming from the federal government are going to be spent. So to give everyone some context, I mean, many of you probably know this, but combination of the Biden administration's desire to invest in infrastructure in the U.S., build back better, between that and I think Justice 40 is another piece that's coming out of his administration for how to spend environmental mitigation money. There's going to be billions of dollars coming for transportation into the state. I mean, every state is going to have this. And what that means is we're going to be making decisions in the next, couple years about how what kind of infrastructure we as a state are building for the next 10 to 15 years. And how we decide to allocate that money is really going to have a lot of bearing on the fossil fuel usage and for our state going decades into the future. And so one point of view that Front and Centered has is that we are approaching this first with the question in our minds of what does our state need, given our climate change crisis, given our our need for growing population and transportation. What do we as a state need? What we are finding among a lot of other forces in the political world in Washington state is that others want to approach the question of first think about what is politically feasible and approach it from that side. And of course, what ultimately needs to be done is where do those two things intersect? What is politically feasible and what is it that we need? And we kind of go for that sweet spot as a broader community. But if you first approach the problem with what is politically feasible, you don't allow yourself to imagine, okay, what are the ways in which we can take what is today politically infeasible and move it to something that is politically feasible. And that is something that is a sort of shift in a point of view that I would encourage all of us to think more about. And so one particular thing that we would love at Front and Centered is support for being strong and saying, no, we don't want to build more roads. So, for example, building more roads in Washington state obligates us not only in the cost of building those roads, it obligates us for the pollution in those locations that, by the way, Peter, tends to be communities that are already overburdened by pollution. And third, the worst part for all of us, even if we live in very nice communities, very nice neighborhoods, is that we're obligated to the fossil fuels that are burned by the vehicles that are going to travel on those roads. So one interesting thing, this ironic thing, is that public transportation infrastructure investments in this state are obligated to do a equity analysis.
Right.
Turns out road infrastructure does not need to have that analysis done, which is kind of backwards and unfair. So one thing that Friend and Centered is doing is we're creating a transit justice index tool. And one thing, there's a couple different tools, but one piece of information that we are trying to make decision makers take into account when they consider transportation options, including roads, is the environmental health impacts of that particular transportation option. So when you're about to build a road, you also have to take into account what are the health effects to the populations that are living where those roads will be built. Example. So these are sort of systemic things, but definitely the willingness to put a stake in the ground and say, hey, we want to have a transportation package that is what our state needs at this moment in time, given the crises, the multiple crises that we have, is something that we're particularly looking for community organizations and partners to join with us on, because many, and I'm going to say this, I am a long time traditional environmental advocate, but many organizations these days are looking first at what they feel is politically feasible. Their feeling is that is not politically feasible. The Republicans are never going to go for it, etc. Friend and Centered, Republicans, they're never going to really like what we want. So there's a little bit of, okay, yes, and yet still we need to ask for what our state needs, really needs, and not be afraid of that.
Excuse me for breaking in again, but it occurs to me that this is an interesting analogy with the Farmland Trust that I referred to before, which managed to get farmers and environmentalists working together because they came up with solutions that were good for both. Now, in this case, it's the drivers that somehow have to be brought on board. They have problems too. If you're a commuter and you don't happen to live along one of the rail lines, you have a real problem getting to mass transit. There are, of course, park and rides and so forth, but it's really
and more investment in public transit would mean that you might have a chance of living close to an option.
Right. So if you got together with the AAA or I don't know who and worked out, a transportation plan which responded to all these constituencies, that would have a better chance, I think.
Need to look for the levers.
Yeah,
for sure. The other thing that that is not well understood, but I think that certainly those of you like in the environment committee that think about this more often, there's a realization that building more road capacity does not improve traffic. A lot of people think that, right? It's a lot like the light bulbs. And do people know what I'm talking about with the light bulbs? Like you increase the efficiency of a light bulb, you think somehow the electricity used for lighting would go down. But what happens is you improve the efficiency of a light bulb, people turn their lights on for longer. And so actually, ironically, the energy expenditure for lighting goes up. And that's kind of what happens with roads. You think it's going to help your traffic,
No, it
but
doesn't.
it doesn't.
To use an old quotation, build it and they will come.
Mm.
So if you improve the roads, people will drive more,
Right. So if you improve public transportation, people will take public transportation more.
hopefully.
Joan, you had your hand up. for a
Yes, I
while.
wanted to, actually, what I wanted to talk about was linked a little bit to what Bill had brought up. And that is having to do with health as in public health, health access, health care access, I should say. And what is the linkage that you have with the federal level about issues around provision of health care and insurance and access to health care other than emergency rooms for people who are less well able to hold on to a primary care doctor and so on?
I don't think I would say that we have a direct linkage to federal health access issues. The way we have engaged in public health has been, to give you an example of the kind of work we do, during COVID, we sponsored a research project. We worked with a researcher at UW, and she researched and produced a paper for us about the gaps in health needs during the pandemic, like which populations were getting access to health associated with COVID. So she created a report that described the types of health holes that were coming up by location. And so it's that kind of health information and topics and themes that we are more closely, dug into. The healthcare access at a federal level has not been an area that we've engaged in. We've been very focused thus far on Washington State in that area. The places where we are starting to get engaged, and we have relating to other similar coalitions in other regions of the country, have tended to be more around carbon pricing and that kind of thing.
And do you have any other bills that you're putting before legislature? Because that's where we could help. Like on this bill, if you'd send us a connect to whichever senators or reps were involved, a lot of us would support you here at
No,
Horizon House.
that's
We do
wonderful to hear.
vote a lot. And we do contact our legislators quite a bit.
That's lovely. I would say on the transportation stuff, we'll know better by the fall if there's a specific bill or not. I don't have those specifics yet, but definitely this summer is going to be a time to lay down some groundwork foundations in terms of collecting the information and building an index tool that will help decision makers see what we see. That's kind of what we're all about, of taking the voices that can feel very disparate and random and putting them in a way that can be understood and digested and
Great.
actionable. So, but I could definitely let you know in the fall
Yes,
what we have
let
going
us
on.
know what you have going on and how we can support or which legislators are involved. Sometimes if there's a link, we'll just go right in and hit it.
Okay, that's lovely.
And thank you again for this incredible program.
Of course, I love talking about front and centered, so I'm happy to do so whenever.
Well, I think we probably have time for another question. Everybody can, at any time in their life, look up the website for frontandcentered.org. No punctuation, runs together. And find lots of information, and including the team, which is really an extensive team, the leadership group that Sharon is part of. Any more
Bill,
questions?
I see Bill's hand raised.
Oh, Bill, go ahead.
Yes, I just staying on the issue of the legislature just for a minute, as you get things developed, who is it that we would work with? Who would we talk to in terms of the kinds of bills that you want to support?
Well, we have a lobbyist on staff who organizes all of our activity in the legislature. That's Guillermo. I can't believe I'm spacing on his last name.
Well, how about just sending us also Paulo's
Yeah.
Paulo would be another person.
Yeah. Well, you can
Those
definitely
two.
send it to me. Guillermo Rogel is the name of our lobbyist. And then, like you said, Paulo Nunez Bueno is our transportation director. And he'd be a great person to hear more from.
Right.
In fact, let me, if you want to hear more about this transit justice index tool that we are building, actually just right now, this is a link to a 15-minute presentation that Paulo makes about some of the work that we want to do with transit.
All right.
It's very concise and he's a great speaker.
Oh, I know Paulo well. So
How did you know him? From TCC board or something like that?
No, he used to work with me back in at Metro long ago.
Awesome. Tom, you had another thought?
Sharon, you introduced the idea before of partnership. So how would this work? Suppose the Environment Committee here at Horizon House formed a group that was going to partner with Front and Center. How would that work out? What would be the linkages and how would the communication occur?
Well, I think that's something that we'd have to talk about and see what you're interested in doing. I mean, it could be as lightweight as staying in communications with us, hearing about what we're doing and seeing if if something comes by that you want to lend support to, and etc. Or a tighter integration is more collaborative, working on a particular campaign. So, for example, Paulo, speaking of Paulo and transportation issues, formed a pretty tight coalition with Disability Rights Washington and 350 Seattle this spring, advancing this point of view of transportation of, hey, we need something that's a little bit stronger for everyone's health and the climate. And how about having considering a package that doesn't have roads in it? Now, I think that Front and Center, that coalition was super successful. There's still roads in the package, but it's a lot reduced from how it was proposed a year ago. So I count that as a strong win for that coalition. So it's about, what you have the energy for and what you want to do. And it's unique. We don't have some kind of cookie cutter relationship that we're like, okay, this is how we want you to interact with us.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you all for having me. I really enjoy talking about Friend and Centered, and I hope that we'll find all sorts of ways to make good trouble.
Thank you, Sharon. And this has just been so wonderful, and we will be in touch. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you from the Environment Committee as well. We will be in touch as well.
Okay.
Right.
Lovely. All
And-
right.
And my Jean Durning for getting this program together. Thank you so
Yes.
much.
Thank you
Jean.
for organizing. Yep. And
Yes,
Risa
yes.
for making it all work today.
Risa, you have been wonderful. And so
Yes, you have.
thank you very much.
All right.
Turn
Good
us
night.
Good night.